Everybody, today Honey is going to continue reading Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger, written by Louis Tracker and illustrated by Tim Houts. The new chapter 13, The New Teacher. The new teacher entered the classroom carrying a big blue notebook stuffed with papers. She had white hair and wore glasses. She was a lot older than anyone else in the class. She took a big breath. My, it's tiring walking up all those stairs, isn't it? She said. Nobody said anything. They just stared at her. She set her notebook on the teacher's desk. My name is Mrs. Drezil, she said, and I'm not from Brazil. She smiled at her little joke. Nobody else smiled. After Mrs. and Mr. Gorf, they didn't trust teachers. Brazil, thought Dee. Where have I heard the name before? Where are you from? Asked Leslie. Actually, I was born not too far from here, said Mrs. Brazil. And then what'd you say you came from Brazil? Asked Benjamin. No, I said I wasn't from Brazil, said Mrs. Brazil. Have you ever been to Brazil? Asked Eric Fry. No, explained Mrs. Brazil. It was just a little joke. Brazil rhymes with Brazil. I thought it might help you remember my name. Terence laughed. Brazil, Brazil, he shouted. That's funny. Several other kids laughed too, but not Dee. She had heard of Mrs. Brazil somewhere. She was sure of it. And whatever she had heard, she was sure it wasn't good. What's a Brazil? Asked Eric Evans. Brazil is the largest country in South America, said Mrs. Brazil. Oh, said Eric Evans. I thought it was one of those things that, a woman wear, on their bosom. Several kids laughed. No, that's a brassiere, said Mrs. Brazil. There was more laughter. Stephen was shocked. She said brassiere, he whispered, right in class. I know, I heard her, said Jason, but Dee still didn't trust her, even if she said brassiere right out loud. There was a television show that Dee liked to watch. It was about real criminals. At the end of the show, they always asked the viewers to call the police if they knew that any of the criminals were. Dee wondered if she had seen Mrs. Brazil on that show. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask me? Asked Mrs. Brazil. Ron raised his hand. Mrs. Brazil pointed to him. How old are you? Asked Ron. Dana gasped. You're not supposed to ask someone that, she said, especially someone as old as Mrs. Brazil, said Mac. Mrs. Brazil smiled. I don't mind, she said. I'm 66 years old. You can ask me anything you want. Anything? Asked Joy. I'm a teacher, said Mrs. Brazil. That's what I'm here for. Paul raised his hand. How much do you weigh? He asked. 124 pounds, said Mrs. Brazil. How much money do you make? Asked Eric Bacon. I'm a substitute teacher, explained Mrs. Brazil, so I only make money on days that I teach. Then I make $51.18 a day. What a riff-off, said Jenny. You should make at least 200. That should be nice, said Mrs. Brazil. But I'm a teacher because I love to teach. I love to see young children learn. Joy raised her hand. How many men have you kissed in your whole life? Mrs. Brazil thought a moment as she appeared to be counting on her fingers. 31, she said. Everyone gasped. Dee raised her hand. Mrs. Brazil smiled at her. Yes, the girl in the pretty flowered t-shirt. Have you ever been in jail? Asked Dee. No, said Mrs. Brazil. Are the police after you? No, said Mrs. Brazil. Dee still didn't trust her. Okay, said Mrs. Brazil. Before we get started, I want to say one more thing. I enjoy teaching so much that sometimes I get a little carried away. I talk too much. So if I start to get boring, Will somebody please raise your hand and tell me? For real? Asked Todd. You want us to tell you to stop talking? And we won't get in trouble? Asked Bibi. No, of course not, said Mrs. Brazil. You'll get helping me and the rest of your class. You're not going to learn anything if you're bold. Cool, said Terence. Oh, I suppose when I first started teaching, I used to be a little more strict, said Mrs. Brazil. I even worried about things like whether my students had clean fingernails or if their shirts were tucked in. She laughed. But some times have changed. I've changed. Besides, the kids were a lot worse back then, at least some of them. For just a second, her sweet face turned sour as she looked at the notebook on her desk. Then she smiled again. I believe teaching requires mutual cooperation. I will cooperate with you, and you need to cooperate with me. If we work together, we will have a very enjoyable learning experience. Her face turned sour again, but if you trust me, you will be very, very sorry. She ran her fingers over the blue notebook. Oh, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday I will get you. You can run, but you can't hide. She smiled. Okay, let's get started. Chapter 14. A light bulb, a pencil sharpener, a coffee pot, and a sack of potatoes. Galileo was a great scientist, said Mrs. Brazil. He was born in Italy in 1564 and died in 1642. He was the first person to use a telescope to study the stars, and he also helped figure out the laws of gravity. Oh, I know about gravity, said Joe. Mrs. Jules pushed the computer out the window. It fell a lot faster than a pencil. I don't think so, said Mrs. Brazil. Galileo proved that all objects fell at the same speed. He conducted a very famous experiment. He dropped lots of different objects off the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is in Italy. It was built in... Todd raised his hand. You're getting a little boring, he said. Oh my goodness, am I? Asked Mrs. Stuartzill. Rondi, Leslie, Paul, and Calvin nodded their heads. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Brazil. She thought a moment. I know, she exclaimed. Let's do the experiment here. The children cheered. They loved experiments. Mrs. Brazil rubbed their hands together. Let's see, we'll need a coffee pot, a pencil sharpener, a light bulb, and she thought a moment. We need something heavy. An elephant's heavy, said Benjamin. There are no elephants in Wayside School, said Mrs. Brazil. Everyone laughed. How about a sack of potatoes? Asked Ron. I bet Miss Mush has one. Go see, said Mrs. Brazil. There's a coffee pot down in the office, said Stephen. Go get it, said Mrs. Brazil. If I had the screwdriver, I could get the pencil sharpener off the wall, said Eric Fry. I've got a screwdriver, said Jenny. Can we use a fluorescent light bulb? Asked Bibi. She looked up at the ceiling. I guess so, said Mrs. Brazil. How do I get it? Asked Bibi. You're the scientist, said Mr. Brazil. You figure it out. Bibi put her chair on top of her desk and stood on it. She still couldn't reach the ceiling. Hey, Benjamin, let me have your chair. She put Benjamin's chair on top of hers, but she still wasn't tall enough. Calvin dumped the waste paper basket onto the floor. Try this, he said. Bibi turned the trash can upside down and put it on top of Benjamin's chair. Then she climbed on top, but she still couldn't quite reach. Leslie brought the class dictionary. Jenny and Dana donated their math books. Sherry grabbed Mrs. Brazil's old blue notebook. Put that down, yelled Mrs. Brazil. Right now. Sherry dropped the notebook. Mrs. Brazil's kindly old face had suddenly turned mean. Don't ever touch that again, said Mrs. Brazil ordered. Shirley returned trembling to her seat. Everyone was staring at Mrs. Brazil. She smiled sweetly. Go back what you're doing, she said. Jason threw Bibi his lunchbox. She sat it on top of the books, then climbed on top. Standing on her tiptoes, she was able to pull the cover off the fluorescent light. She grabbed the light just as the pile collapsed beneath her. She fell to the ground, triumphantly holding the unbroken light bulb high above her head. Ron returned with a sack of potatoes from Miss Mush. Stephen returned with Mr. Kitchwater's coffee pot. Eric Fry unscrewed the pencil sharpener from the wall. Mrs. Brazil wrote coffee pot, sack of potatoes, pencil sharpener, and light bulb on the blackboard. We're going to drop all four objects out the window at the same time, she said. How many people think the coffee pot will hit the ground first? Is there coffee in it? Asked John. It's about half full, Stephen reported. 8 kids thought that the coffee pot would hit the ground first. 16 thought the sack of potatoes would hit the ground first. 3 thought the light bulb would be first. Only Terence thought the pencil sharpener would hit first. Jason, Jenny, Joe, John, and Joy were the judges. Mrs. Drezil sent them outside. Stephen held the coffee pot out one window. Phoebe held the light bulb out another. Eric Fry held the pencil sharpener out another. And Ron held out the sack of potatoes. Everyone else crowded around to watch. With everyone on their same side of the classroom, the school leaned a little bit, just like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. On your mark, get set, let's go, said Mrs. Drezil. The object fell through the air and smashed against the pavement. A short while later, the judges returned. Their clothes were bespattered with coffee. Jenny had bits of potatoes in her hair. Was the pencil sharpener first? Asked Terence. It happened so fast, said Joe. They all hit about the same time. But the coffee pot made a coolest explosion, said Jason. I think the light bulb hit the ground last, said John. Well, that's possible, said Mrs. Drezil. Gravity causes all objects to fall at the same rate, but the air slows them down. That's what air resistance is. That's good. Otherwise, raindrops will kill us. Air resistance slows all things down a little bit, but it has a greater effect on very light objects, such as a piece of paper. And of course, the shape of the paper is important too. A crumpled up piece of paper will fall faster than. You're getting boring again, said Mac. Mrs. Brazil stopped talking. Now we need a new pencil sharpener, said Leslie. Paul licked her ear. Chapter 15. An Elephant in Wayside School. The bell rang for recess, and the children exploded out of the building. Louis, the yard teacher, was already ready with a big pile of red and green balls. The kids yelled, Hi, Louis! And over here, Louis, as he tossed the balls to them, over his shoulder, behind his back, through his legs. Dee Dee came charging out of the building. Usually by the time she got to the playground, there was no good balls left, but she could see one red ball by Louis's foot. She knocked over a kid from the 10th floor and shouted, Hey, Lou! Suddenly she stopped. She had just remembered where she heard of Mrs. Drezil. She thought it was from Louis. He had once told her about the meanest teacher he'd ever had when he was a kid. She hurried over to her friends to make sure. Hey, Todd, she called. Todd was playing tetherball with Ron. As he turned to look at Dee Dee, the ball came around and boinked him at his head. Do you remember when Louis told us about the meanest teacher he ever had? Asked Dee Dee. Todd shook his head. After being conked by a tetherball, he couldn't remember anything. I remember, said Jason, who was in line to play. Whenever Louis got in trouble, the teacher used to put a waste paper basket on his head. That's right, said Jenny, and then Louis would have to keep it there the rest of the day, and everyone would laugh at him, and then the teacher would call him to answer questions from the blackboard, and he couldn't see the questions, so she'd give him an F. Do you remember the teacher's name? Asked Dee Dee. Her friend shook her head. Todd couldn't even remember his own name. I think it was Mrs. Brazil's, said Dee Dee. They ran to Louis. Hey, Louis, said Jason. What was the name of the mean teacher you once had when you were a kid? Which one? Asked Louis. The one that put the trash can over your head, said Jenny. Louis shuddered just thinking about her. Mrs. Drazil, he whispered. The kids looked at each other. What color hair did she have? Asked Jason. Brown, said Louis. Why? We have a substitute teacher, explained Dee Dee. She's real nice. Good, said Louis. Her name is Mrs. Drazil, said Dee Dee. Well, I'm getting out of here, said Louis. He started to run, but the kid grabbed him. It's okay, said Jenny. It can't be the same teacher. Our teacher is nice, and her hair isn't brown, said Jason. It's white. Louis relaxed a little bit. You want to come up and meet her? Asked Dee Dee. No way, said Louis. Oh, you're so silly, Louis, said Dee Dee. It's not the same teacher, and besides, you're a teacher now, too. Oh, yeah, I forgot, said Louis. Come on, Louis, said Dee Dee. She held his hand and led him up the stairs. They entered the classroom. Mrs. Drazil was putting some of the children's work on the bulletin board. Mrs. Drazil, said Dee Dee, we brought our yard teacher up to meet you. It's very nice to meet you, said Mrs. Drazil as she pinned up the Joe's arithmetic task. Exercise is so important for young minds and bodies. She turned around. Louis's face paled. Well, it was nice to meet you, he said very quickly. I've gotta go. Bye. Stay right where you are, Louis, ordered Mrs. Drazil. He froze. Mrs. Drazil slowly walked to her desk. She picked up the old blue notebook. The notebook, whispered Louis. Mrs. Brazil opened it and flipped through the pages. Here we are, she said. She moved a piece of paper and handed it to Louis. Is this your homework? She asked. Louis looked at it. You're supposed to copy it over, weren't you? Asked Mrs. Drazil. That was over 15 years ago, said Louis. I don't remember. I do, said Mrs. Drazil. Oh, now I remember, said Louis. I was going to copy it over, but then my pencil point broke, so I went to sharpen it, but the pencil sharpener fell on my foot, so I have to go to the hospital. I don't want any of your famous excuses, Louis, said Mrs. Drazil. I just want the homework. You may share Dee Dee's desk. Louis sat next to Dee Dee. And remember, Louis, said Mrs. Drazil, I know your tricks. Dee Dee watched Louis struggle with his homework. Sorry, Louis, she said. Don't be sorry, said Mrs. Drazil. It's for his own good. And I expect neatness, Louis, or else you'll just have to do it again. He frowned. Mrs. Drazil stood over him and watched him work. Your fingernails are filthy, she said. I'm the yard teacher, Louis tried to explain. I spend a lot of time outside in the grass and dirt and stuff. I don't want excuses, said Mrs. Drazil. I want clean fingernails. And while you're at it, shave off your dead mustache. It looks like a hairy caterpillar crawling across your face. Not my mustache, said Louis. Unless you want me to rip it off for you, said Mrs. Drazil. Dee Dee felt terrible. I can't believe Mrs. Drazil still remembers you after all the time, she said. An elephant never forgets, muttered Louis. I heard that, said Mrs. Drazil. She put the waste paper basket on Louis's head.